I took a night shift at a storage facility to make rent, and one of the units started being rented under my own name, even though I never signed anything, leading me into a chain of records no one wanted me to see. The first time I saw my own name on a rental record I never signed, I thought it had to be some kind of clerical mistake. That was the only explanation that made sense. I was working nights at a storage facility just outside the city because I needed rent money fast. Nothing glamorous, just rows of metal units, fluorescent lights, security cameras, and people storing the kind of things they didn't want to deal with every day. Furniture, boxes, old documents, seasonal junk, and occasionally something suspicious enough that you learn not to ask questions. The job was boring in the exact way night shifts usually are. Quiet, repetitive, half the time nothing happened. I'd do my rounds, check the gate, sign in late arrivals, and sit at the front desk pretending to read while the building hummed around me. The whole place had a strange atmosphere after midnight. Not haunted, not dramatic, just off enough to make your skin feel a little too awake. Long hallways, motion sensors that clicked on and off, rows of identical doors, the kind of place where you could hear a single footstep from 2 corridors away. I'd been there about 3 weeks when I noticed the record. It was in the lease log, printed on a sheet the daytime manager had left behind for me to file. A new unit had been rented that evening. The customer name was mine. Not similar to mine, not a weird typo, my full legal name spelled correctly. My first reaction was irritation. I figured someone in the office had accidentally entered the wrong name and I'd have to fix it in the morning. It was annoying but not frightening. Mistakes happen, especially in places where overworked people are doing 10 things at once. Then I looked at the signature line. It wasn't mine. It was a shaky digital scrawl from the account form, and beneath it were details I had not provided. An alternate phone number, an email address I didn't recognize, and a contact address in a part of town I'd never lived in. I stared at the page long enough that one of the cameras above the desk caught my reflection in the glass. I remember thinking, that's weird, and then actually, that's not just weird. The unit number was 42B. I checked the map on the wall. 42B was in the back row, one of the larger indoor units. I pulled up the security camera feed for the corridor outside it, and saw that the lock had already been changed. No truck had come through the gate, no one had checked in under my name, no one had called me, yet the system said the unit was active, paid for, and assigned to me. I looked through the paperwork again, and that was when I saw something else. The billing address wasn't random. It was my old address. The apartment I'd moved out of nearly 2 years earlier. That was the first time I felt the bottom of the situation shift under me. I tried calling the number listed on the record. It went to voicemail immediately, but the greeting was silent, like the account hadn't been set up properly. I then checked the internal notes section and saw a short line from the front office manager. Customer requested no contact by phone, use paper notices only. I sat there for a minute staring at that sentence. No contact by phone. Paper notices only. That wasn't normal language. It sounded like a rule from a different kind of arrangement entirely. I was still trying to understand it when the front gate alarm chirped. A car had entered the property. I looked out the side window and saw a black sedan rolling slowly down the access lane, headlights low, no logo, no obvious signage. It moved like the driver already knew where they were going. Then I watched it stop directly in front of Unit 42B. And for one awful second, I had the distinct feeling that whoever was in that car had come because they knew I was looking at the file. I stood up so quickly I knocked the chair over. The driver's door opened. And the person who stepped out was someone I knew. Someone I had not seen in years. Someone who had every reason not to be connected to my name in a storage facility lease. Part 2 of 5. It was my uncle, Darren. I hadn't seen him in almost 6 years, not since a family fallout that nobody ever fully explained to me. He and my mother had stopped speaking after some ugly argument over money, and after that he just disappeared from family events. No cards, no calls, no awkward holiday appearances. He had been erased from the family rhythm so completely that I'd mostly stopped thinking about him. So seeing him step out of a black sedan in the middle of my shift, at a storage facility, was about the last thing I expected. He didn't look surprised to see me. That was the worst part. He looked tired, which somehow made it worse than if he had looked guilty or caught. Like he had been expecting this exact problem to arrive eventually, and was just annoyed that it had arrived on my shift. He shut the car door and walked toward the front office with the calm of someone entering a place he had already mentally prepared for. I stood there behind the desk, watching him through the glass, not sure whether to greet him or ask him what the hell he was doing. Before I could decide, he said, "You shouldn't be here tonight." That was not a normal thing to say to your nephew at a storage facility. I asked him if he knew about the unit. He didn't answer that directly. He looked at the printed lease sheet on the desk, then at my face and said, "So they put your name on it." I felt my stomach tighten. "They?" I said. "Who are they?" He leaned one hand on the counter and looked toward the hallway before speaking lower, like the walls themselves might be listening. "Did anyone tell you not to contact the account by phone?" I just stared at him. He nodded once, like that confirmed something he already suspected. Then he asked me where I'd seen the paperwork. I told him the front office file. He let out a slow breath and said, "That means the records are still moving." I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded bad enough to make my skin go cold. I asked him how he even knew about the unit. He hesitated, and for the first time he looked uncomfortable, not with me, with the answer. "Because I've been trying to keep that unit empty for a long time," he said. I remember just standing there staring at him, trying to decide if I was angry, confused, or both. He must have seen my face because he held up a hand and said, "I know how it looks. I do." That's not a helpful sentence. I know. He glanced at the security monitor behind me and lowered his voice even more. "Listen to me, if your name is on that lease, somebody wants it there." That was the moment the shape of the problem changed. Not a clerical error, not an administrative glitch, something intentional. I asked who would want that. He looked at me for a long second, then said, "People who still keep old records." That answer made no sense by itself, but I could tell it meant something to him. I asked what was in 42B. He didn't answer. I asked again. He looked straight at me and said, "Your mother told you I left because of money, didn't she?" I didn't say anything. He gave a small, bitter laugh. "She left out the part about the papers." That sentence landed hard. I asked him what papers he meant. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, but instead of handing it to me, he just held it there for a second like he was deciding whether I was old enough to know what was inside. Then he said, "If you want to understand why your name ended up on that lease, you need to know what your mother asked me to do before I disappeared." I told him to stop talking like that and just say it. He looked at the camera above the desk, then back at me. "No," he said, "not here." He turned to leave. I called after him, asking where he was going, and he only said one thing before walking out into the dark parking lot. "Check the unit before morning." That was the moment I realized he had not come to warn me out of kindness. He had come because the lease had already put me in the middle of something I wasn't supposed to see. And somehow, my uncle was even more afraid of what was in that storage unit than I was. By the time my uncle left the parking lot, I was already trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. That lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then I went back to the desk, pulled the printed lease record closer, and read every line of it again like the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming if I stared hard enough. They didn't. My name was still there. The billing address was still my old apartment. The contact note still said paper notices only. That line bothered me more than anything else. People don't usually hide behind paper notices unless they do not want a conversation, or unless they want a conversation controlled through someone else. I checked the camera feed for the corridor outside 42B and saw that the lock had indeed been changed. There was no visible movement in the hall, no one going in or out, no obvious sign that the unit had been accessed that night. But the fact that my uncle had shown up at all meant one thing. He knew exactly where the unit was, and he knew enough to be worried about my name being attached to it. I was on the edge of doing something stupid when the day manager called in from home. She sounded half asleep when she answered, then fully awake the second I asked her about the lease record. I told her the system had assigned a unit under my name and that I thought there was a mistake. She went quiet. Not let me check quiet. The kind of quiet that means the other person already knows there's a problem and is deciding how much to admit. Finally she said, "You shouldn't be seeing that file." I told her that was not a reassuring response. She asked me not to touch anything until morning. I asked who had rented 42B. She said nobody currently. I looked back at the printed log on the desk. That's not what the paper says. Another pause. Then she said, "That unit has changed hands a few times." I asked her what that meant. She said it means the records are messy. Messy? That was what she called it. I pushed harder, and eventually she admitted that 42B had been the subject of an old ownership dispute from before the facility changed management. Not a big public case. Nothing that made the news. Just the sort of family and property mess that gets passed around quietly until someone no longer wants their name attached to it. That should have made the situation less scary. It didn't. Because the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she was choosing every word very carefully. She would not say who had rented it before. She would not say why paper notices were preferred. She would not explain why my name appeared in a lease log that, according to her, shouldn't still be active. I asked her whether anyone had accessed the file tonight. She hesitated too long. I pressed again. Then she said there was a request to duplicate the records. That hit like ice water. From who? She wouldn't say. I looked down at my own name on the page and felt my stomach knot. Then she gave me one of those answers that isn't really an answer, just a sentence shaped like one. If your uncle came by, then you need to be careful. That was all I got. After I hung up, I spent the next 20 minutes checking the back office and the locked filing cabinet where older lease records were kept. Most of the files were boring: expired rentals, abandoned units, late payment notices, damaged padlock reports. Then I found a thin cardboard folder with no label on the front. Inside were photocopies. Old ones. Some were so faded I could barely read them. Others were recent enough to be obvious duplicates. There were names, dates, signatures, and handwritten notes on the margins that made no sense to me at first. One page had a small symbol drawn in blue ink in the corner. Another had a note that simply said, "Do not transfer to digital." I sat there in the back office with the folder open in front of me, trying to understand why an old storage rental would generate warning notes like that. Then I found the page that made my hands go cold. It was a photocopy of a lease agreement from years earlier. The name on it was my mother. Not as a guarantor, not as a contact. As the renter. And listed in the extra notes column, right beneath her name, was the same exact phrase I had seen on tonight's lease log. Use paper notices only. That was the moment I stopped thinking this was about a paperwork mistake. My mother had signed something once. Something involving that unit. Something involving people who wanted records kept out of the computer system. And apparently my uncle knew enough about it to come running the moment my name appeared in the wrong place. I stayed in the office until nearly dawn, waiting for answers that weren't coming. Every time I heard a sound in the hallway, I expected someone to walk in and demand the folder back, but no one did. Instead, right before shift change, I found another item slipped under the front desk while I'd been in the back room. An envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just my name on the front, in handwriting I knew immediately. My uncle's. Inside was a single key taped to a note. The note said, "If your mother asks where you found this, tell her the truth. Then ask her why she signed the unit away the first time." That was the first time I considered the possibility that my family had not only known about 42B. They may have started the whole mess in the first place. I waited until I got home to ask my mother about the note. That was probably a mistake, but I didn't want to have the conversation in the storage office parking lot, where anybody could be listening, and I definitely didn't want to call her while I was still trying to keep my voice steady. So I drove home with the key in my pocket and the envelope on the passenger seat, and the whole time I kept thinking about that line. Why she signed the unit away the first time. It sounded less like a question and more like a threat. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked in. She was making tea, which would have been normal if she hadn't looked up the second I stepped through the door. That's the thing about guilt or fear in a family. You can feel it before anyone says a word. She saw my face and immediately knew this wasn't a casual conversation. "What happened?" she asked. I held up the envelope and said, "Did you know about Unit 42B?" She went very still. Then I saw the answer on her face before she spoke. Not confusion, not surprise, recognition. She set the kettle down too carefully and asked where I'd gotten the note. I told her it was from Darren. She closed her eyes for a second. That told me everything and nothing at the same time. She knew he was involved, but she also knew I had crossed into something she had hoped would stay buried. I asked her directly whether she had rented the unit before. She said yes. That one word opened the floor under the entire conversation. I asked her what had been in it. She said storage. I looked at her and nearly laughed. "No, try again." She rubbed her forehead and said, "Furniture, boxes, documents, nothing you need to panic over." That was when I realized she was doing the thing families do when the truth is too heavy. She was trying to reduce it into categories that sounded harmless. Boxes, documents, furniture, as if labels could make history less dangerous. I put the key on the table between us and asked her why Darren said she'd signed the unit away the first time. She stared at the key for a long time before answering. Then she said, because he was supposed to keep it off the books. I asked what that meant. She looked at me with a kind of exhausted sadness I didn't understand yet and said, "You're asking about the wrong part of the story." I told her I was asking about the part with my name on it. That finally got a real reaction. Her mouth tightened, and for the first time that night she looked angry instead of afraid. "You weren't supposed to be involved," she said. "That's not an answer. It is if you understand how these things work." I told her I didn't understand anything, which was true enough to make her pause. Then she finally gave me pieces. Not all at once. My mother never did anything all at once. She gave me enough to keep me leaning forward and frustrated, but never enough to let me feel like I had the full truth. Years earlier, before I was old enough to remember, she and Darren had been involved in helping someone store records that were supposed to stay private. Not criminal evidence in the dramatic sense, but enough to create a situation where the wrong people would absolutely not want those papers digitized or exposed. The storage unit was meant to be temporary. Temporary turned into years. She said Darren was the one who managed access, but she was the one who signed the original lease under her name because he couldn't do it without drawing attention. That was the part she admitted most reluctantly. I asked who the records belonged to. She refused to answer at first. Then she said, people who didn't want to be connected to each other anymore. That wasn't enough for me, and she knew it. So she added, family. I felt my stomach drop. Not our family only, other families, connected families, the kind of old arrangement nobody likes explaining out loud because the moment you do, everything gets bigger and uglier. I asked her if my name had been used, because of me personally. She didn't answer, which of course was an answer. The more she talked, the more obvious it became that the storage unit was only the latest layer of a much older structure. Darren had spent years trying to keep the records from being transferred, while my mother had apparently spent years trying not to think about the fact that she'd signed the first lease at all. Somewhere in the middle of all that sat my name, dropped into the system like a magnet catching filings. I told her I'd found the photocopied lease with her name on it. That changed her expression again. You shouldn't have taken that. I didn't take it, it was in the office. Her face went a little grey. And that's when she said the line that made the whole thing turn even darker. If they started copying the old files again, then somebody is trying to reopen it. I asked what it was. She looked toward the hallway, then back at me and said, the part we buried. I wanted to demand a real answer, but before I could, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. No profile photo, no saved contact. Just 3 words. Check the key. I looked at the envelope on the table, and then at the little brass key lying beside my mother's teacup. There was a number engraved on it. 42B. That's when it hit me that Darren had not simply handed me a key. He had given me access to the thing my name had been attached to, for reasons neither of them wanted to explain in one breath. And worse, somebody else now knew I had it. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the key on my desk and stared at it every time I passed by, as if it might suddenly explain itself if I waited long enough. My mother didn't say much after the text came through. She just looked at the key, then at me, and for the first time since I'd come home, she seemed genuinely afraid rather than merely defensive. At around 1 in the morning, I heard my phone buzz again. Another unknown number. This time the message was shorter. Do not open 42B alone. I stared at the screen until the words went blurry. My first instinct was to call Darren, but when I tried, the number went straight to voicemail. That made everything worse. He'd been the one pushing me toward the truth, and now he had vanished into silence at the exact moment somebody else was warning me away from the unit. I showed the text to my mother. She went pale and said, "That's not good." That was the only way she could describe it. Not dangerous, not terrible, just not good, which in her language meant far worse than she was willing to say out loud. I asked her who had sent it. She shook her head. "I don't know." "Do you know who would care if I opened the unit?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "People who still think those records belong to them." That made my skin crawl. I pressed her harder. Was it family? An old business issue, some kind of property dispute? She kept circling the answer without namming it, and every time she did, I felt more certain that this had never been about storage at all. The unit was just the container. The actual secret was whatever had been sealed inside it so long that everyone had started acting as if the box itself was the truth. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. I drove back to the storage facility on 2 hours of sleep and a head full of bad instincts. The front lot was nearly empty, the air still cold, and the building looked just as ordinary as it had the night before, which only made it more unsettling. Secrets always look smaller in daylight. The office door was unlocked. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The second was the missing folder on the counter. The lease record I'd seen the night before was gone. Not filed away, gone. I searched the back office, the filing cabinet, the desk drawers, and every shelf I could reach. The photocopied record with my mother's name on it had disappeared too. Someone had been here after my shift, or maybe during it. Either way, they'd known exactly what to take. When I got to the corridor outside 42B, the lock on the unit had been changed again. Fresh metal, fresh padlock, no dust on the latch. Someone was working fast now. I stood there with the key in my hand, staring at the door, and for a second I almost talked myself out of it. Maybe I should wait. Maybe I should bring someone. Maybe I should stop digging into family problems that had already swallowed enough people. Then I thought about the texts. Do not open alone. That was the kind of warning that makes you want to do the opposite. So I opened it anyway. The key turned easily. Too easily. The door rolled up with a metallic scrape that echoed down the corridor, and cold air rolled out from the unit in a wave that smelled like old paper and dust. For a second, I couldn't see anything except stacked blackness. Then the flashlight from my phone caught the first shelf. Boxes. Not random storage, organized boxes, labeled folders, file crates, a small locked filing cabinet shoved into the back corner, and right in the middle of the floor, sitting on a folding chair like it had been waiting for me, was a manila envelope with my name on it. I walked in slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to touch anything. The envelope was thick. Inside were documents, copies, old photographs, lease records, a few handwritten pages, one of which had my mother's signature on it again, and another that had Darren's name beside a note about transfer authorization. There were also printed emails, multiple addresses, warnings about duplicates, requests to keep certain files out of the system. And then I found the page that changed everything. It was a property transfer record. The unit had not just been rented under my name once. It had been reassigned over and over, each time tied to a different branch of the same family network my mother had been trying to step around for years. My name had been entered into it because somebody wanted a clean continuation of an old arrangement, a living placeholder, a new person attached to an old mess. I sat down on the floor of the unit and just stared at the papers because the whole thing finally made a terrible kind of sense. My mother hadn't been lying about the storage unit being temporary. It had always been temporary. The problem was that temporary had been inherited like a curse. The reason my name had appeared on the lease was because someone had decided I was the next acceptable handoff, not because of anything I had done, because of who I was related to, and because old records had a way of resurfacing when nobody wanted to claim them. The envelope also contained one final note. It was unsigned. It said, "If he gave you the key, then he finally chose a side." That line sat in my head like a weight. I didn't know whether he meant Darren or someone else. I didn't know whether the side was mine, my mother, or the truth itself, but I knew one thing for certain now: nobody had ever planned to tell me any of this voluntarily. I locked the unit, left the folder exactly where I found it, and drove home feeling like I had crossed into a version of my own family history that had been sealed off for decades. When I got back, my mother was waiting at the table. She looked at my face and knew instantly that I had opened 42B. I didn't even need to speak. I put the envelope down in front of her. She saw the papers, shut her eyes, and whispered, "So it finally came back." That was all she said. Not an explanation, not an apology, just recognition. I asked her what came back. She looked at me for a very long time before answering. Then she said, "The part we thought we'd buried." And that was the last honest thing anyone in my family said to me for a long time. Because after that, Darren disappeared again, the text stopped, and the storage facility quietly changed management papers within a week. No one would answer my questions. No one would explain why the unit had been active under my name. And the worst part was that every record I'd seen had been real enough to know this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a family system built to hide itself. And somehow I'd been written into it.